10 minutes later, Maggie went downstairs. She walked quietly into the dining room. She sat down. Mrs. Tulliver saw her daughter. She screamed and dropped a plate. Everybody looked at Maggie.
"Who is this?"
said Mr. Dean. He laughed.
"Maggie is a naughty girl,"
said Mrs. Clegg. Maggie started to cry again. She stood up and she ran to her father.
"Don't cry, Maggie," Mr. Tulliver said. "I love you. I will take care of you."
After dinner, Tom, Maggie and Lucy went into the garden. Mr. and Mrs. Tulliver talked to the Deans and the Gleggs. "Mr. Tulliver," said Mrs. Tulliver, "tell everybody your plan."
"I want Tom to have a good education," Mr. Tulliver said. "He will go to a new teacher in August. He will go to Mr. Stelling. He will learn everything, history, Latin, mathematics." "Tom doesn't need Latin," Mrs. Clegg said. "He is going to be a miller." "He is not going to be a miller," Mr. Tulliver replied. "He's not as clever as Maggie, but I want Tom to have a good education." "Tom must learn useful things, not Latin," Mrs. Clegg said. "That is my advice."
Mr. Tulliver did not like Mrs. Clegg.
"You always give advice," he said, "but you don't give people money." "No, I don't give people my money," Mrs. Clegg replied. "But I have lent my money. I have lent money to somebody in this room."
Mr. Tulliver was very angry.
"Yes," he shouted, "you have lent me £500, and I pay you interest. I pay you £25 every year." "Don't shout at me," said Mrs. Clegg. Then she stood up. "Mr. Clegg, take me home," she said. "Yes, go home, Mrs. Clegg," Mr. Tulliver shouted. "I will pay you the money next week." Mrs. Clegg left the room, and her husband followed her. But Mr. Tulliver did not have £500. He could not pay Mrs. Clegg. The next week, he went to a friend. He borrowed the money. He borrowed £500. Then he paid Mrs. Clegg.